Found it. Okay. Oop,
I got it now. Now that you told me, I got it now.
Very good. Good morning. I'll call the Finance Committee to order. And first on our schedule, we have the Department of Administrative Services. I see the Commissioner and his able staff here to explain the handout that Mr. Ripple has just passed out. Welcome. Whatever works.
I'm Charlie Arling. Let's try that again. I'm Charlie Arlinghouse. I'm the Commissioner of Administrative Services and technologically challenged, apparently. You are?
Cassie Keene, I'm the Deputy Commissioner.
I'm Sherry Rockbird, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner.
So there we go. All three of us here for you. I have a handout to sort of guide our discussion based on what I think you wanted to hear, based on rumors and innuendos about what went on and was said in meetings and that you had interest in. But if you look at page 2, it's sort of a table of contents. I'm going to talk about governance, collective bargaining, inflation, the classification system, reforming the system, recruitment, and hiring. I'm going to start on page 3 talking about the governance system. The executive branch job classification system and employee compensation. Think of it as the civil service system. I try to explain this to people because we use a lot of terms that people don't necessarily understand. What do you mean? What's the classification system? What is that? What is that thing? And it, you know, I don't want to get into a discussion of the assassination of James Garfield and the creation of a merit system and Social Security Act amendments from the 30s. But we're governed by state and federal law, administrative rules, collective bargaining agreement between the state and 14 different unions, which is more than it used to be, and it seems like it's growing all the time. There's probably 1 or 2 people here who remember back when there were something like 2 unions as opposed to 14. Probably not that many people here who remember that, but the key RSAs, in case anyone wants to look at them, RSA 21I, which is the Admin Services RSA. Section 42 talks about Division of Personnel establishing a job classification system. 273A is the Public Labor Relations Law, collective bargaining law, which dates to 1975, as I think some people know about what's bargained. And then there's some provisions in RSA 99 about the adjustments of salaries. It's primarily about classified positions. Unclassified, they're governed in a slightly different way. Turning to page 4, I want to talk about collective bargaining agreements. There's a lot of collective bargaining agreements. There are 14 different collective bargaining agreements. The unions are bargained with both together and separately. And to give you a sense of the balkanization of the process, I think when I started, there were 9, and now there are 14. And, you know, I don't know exactly the time frame, but go back maybe 10 years and there were 4, go back 20 years and there were 2 or 3. It's not just the SCA, it's a whole bunch of different unions. So today, the governor and the 14 unions have tentatively agreed to an across-the-board 10% COLA with 2% the year after. And there are other provisions of that agreement, but those are the 2 that I think you're most interested in talking about. There have been some discussion about, can the legislature change the negotiated union contracts? The answer to that is no. And I have a little thumbs up and thumbs down here to say that your role is functionally to say yes or no. You fund it or you don't fund it, so to speak. It's an agreement between the governor on one hand and the unions on the other.
I had a question about the Joint Committee on Employee Relations, which I was on years ago. And as far as I know, I've talked with people that should have been on it last December when some of this negotiation was going on. I don't believe that committee has met on this contract, have they?
I'm not aware that they have. And I think I would be aware that they had, because the person who would have come brief you works for me. So they have not, and historically they haven't. The history of that agreement is the legislature involving itself in the process and updating itself on what's going on. In theory, telling the bargaining team, the governor's bargaining team, if you will, what they wished would be negotiated. Historically, it's very rare that group has ever met.
My experience was we met on it years ago on some facet, and all we were told at the time was you can say yes or no. And we said no. Then we negotiated and took out the part we disliked, and we were happy.
That sounds right. And I'm glad that that's a committee that you ended up happy as a result of. That's so rare these days. It's certainly not usually my experience, but that group is typically more involved in years when the legislature and the governor are in different parties. For example, I think it was somewhat active when Governor Hassan was governor and the legislature was Republican, and it was somewhat active in 1920 when the reverse situation existed: Republican governor, Democratic legislature.
Well, the experience was after we had exercised some control over the budget, subsequently the Democrats removed the committee.
Well, I think it's come back.
Did away with it. And then when the Republicans took over, we brought it back. But as far as I know, I don't think it's met to get involved in any of the negotiations since.
The historic ups and downs I'd have to look at. They're often involved when there's a fact finding. Let's say the unions and the governor don't reach an agreement and there are fact finding reports. I know there were hearings in I'm going to say 2019 with regard to fact finder reports, and that occasionally comes up. So one of the questions related to the bargaining agreement is how much has inflation eroded wages? And
Yes, we have another question.
oh, I'm
Representative Holt.
sorry. Yes. Hello.
Good morning. Good to see you. So on page, there's no page numbers, the one regarding collective bargaining agreements, right?
Yes.
When you use the term tentatively agreed, can you be more explicit?
The agreement between a governor and a union is you'll sometimes hear the shorthand OETA'd that, and what it means is that there's a tentative agreement between the two bodies. They write a formal document. That document becomes effective with the funding of the cost items by the legislature. So tentative agreement is a term of art in collective bargaining, and it just suggests it's not effective. The agreement is not effective until after the legislature act. Yeah.
So back to, right, definitions matter, right? If there is a tentative agreement in place and the legislature doesn't fund it, does that then kick it back to a review of that agreement? Just what happens in a flow chart process-wise?
If you don't fund it, the agreement is rejected, and collective bargaining would have to either begin again or be in holdover status for 2 years.
Thank you.
Representative Edwards has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the legislature needs to always remain vigilant to and jealous of our power of the purse. And so in this third bullet where you say we could either say yes or no to the agreement, it seems to me like there's probably a third way I want to run by you. What if we just said, hey, there's not enough money, here's 5%, not 10%. And you don't have to use it for this if you don't want to or not. But this is what we're going to appropriate. So
The agreement, a collective bargaining agreement is an agreement between both parties on a multitude of items, and the bargaining team on the one hand, which is acting on behalf of the governor signs and the SEA president signs, for example, on the SEA contract, is a contract on a multitude of items, and in theory, I think legally, the items are of a whole. In theory, someone would say, we agreed to 10, not 9, or we agreed to 10, not 11, depending on your perspective, based on this and this and this. And if the whole package isn't there, then we would have to negotiate the whole package. So in terms of partially funding, the effect of partially funding would be to set aside money in the budget to fund a future collective bargaining agreement, as opposed to partially fund this agreement. So this agreement, because of lack of funding, so discussion you probably ought to also have with the AG's office, and I know the AG's office has sent you a document on this, but the bargaining agreement is done and has to be renegotiated. You would be, on behalf of the legislature, saying this is the limit with which we would fund, which has sometimes happened in the past. If you decide to partially fund cost items in a document, one of the things I would suggest is that we have a conversation about that. Because for example, one year, a few years back, the legislature partially funded only the general fund portions of an agreement, which meant that if you were an employee who was not generally funded, for example, which is most of our employees, highway funded, turnpike funded, partially federally funded.
I want to
weren't
let
funded.
you know you answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So how much? So why 10% and how much is inflation eroded wages? If you look at page 5, which oddly does have a page number as opposed to 4, that's odd. Historically, the cost of living agreements have typically kept pace with wages, and only not over the last 5 years. And I have data here just to. So I did the data once a long time ago to amuse myself because this is what I do. But if you look at it from 93 to 98, the cumulative COLAs and inflation were roughly the same from 98 to 2018. And those are picked because they're round number periods. It's about the same. If you want to look at 15 years instead of 10, they're about the same. We kept up. Historically, the state has kept up. Inflation has been difficult over the last 5 years, as people are aware in a lot of areas. And so while inflation has been about 20%, COLAs have been about 5%. And I think that's probably, not speaking for the bargaining committee, the source of those numbers. With a 10 and a 2, we will not quite, but almost catch up with inflation, but not quite. So that's the bargaining agreements.
Question, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. Is your inflation column CPI inflation?
Yes, I'm sorry, it's CPI.
Thank you.
It's CPI downloaded from the BLS website, non-seasonally adjusted, if you really want to try to replicate. But I can send you the table.
Follow up.
Yeah, I discovered fairly recently, looking at much longer terms, that inflation in wages is quite different than inflation in things. And so it's possible that CPI is not the appropriate comparison. Thank you.
I think there are multiple things to use, but historically, when it's discussed in bargaining, I think they use CPI because it's a measure of what theoretically the wages can buy. And if you've been to Market Basket lately, which is a wonderful store, but their prices seem to be going up. So that's a thing. Okay. If there are no other questions on that, the executive branch job classification system. What is a job classification system? A job classification system is designed to provide an objective and equitable process to group job duties and responsibilities. It's just a definition. I think people sort of understand that. Large employers, almost all public entities and most large employers, depending on the size, use some sort of a classification system to allocate jobs. And the idea is broad equity. A classification system is meant to promote parity in titles and responsibilities, to have consistent job levels, and then salary ranges that are determined by identified rating factors. I happen to list here what our current system identifies as rating factors: know-how, scope and effect, complexity, work environment, communication, independent action. This is something, rating factors is something we've used since 1950 when the three disparate systems were merged into one in Sherm-Adams bill, if you will. And it's something that I think this dates back to the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company in the 1890s, if you really want to look it up. But that's the point. We have a system where every job in the state is allocated and is placed in a spot in a giant grid. Our grid happens to have 35 labor grades and 9 steps, when everything is plopped somewhere into the grid. And you look at your job and say, what do you do exactly? Okay, this and this. And in order to make a comparative assessment, rather than saying, well, geez, I like him, so why don't we make him a labor grade 16? And you, not so much, so you're a 12. We look at it and say, what's the position? What are the duties? And we factor them in, and it produces a number that comes out of. This is similar to how unclassified jobs are measured by the Hay, now Korn Ferry Group, through the JCEC process. So reforming the classification system. There are a couple things to say. I mean, first of all, the fact that reform is necessary is something people have talked about for 50 years, right? And those of you who've been around for a couple of years will remember the mid-90s, there was the Winter Commission, which was a national group, I think headed by the former governor of Mississippi or Missouri, something that begins with Miss. And around the same time, there was Al Gore had a reforming federal government kind of commission at the same time. And one of the things, a lot of things they identified then and we're looking at now. I want to start by saying it's budget neutral. And we say this all the time, both to assure managers and assure budgeteers and assure employees. Everybody will be mapped somewhere in the new system. Nobody's salary will go up or go down as a result of this. Everybody will be placed in a new position, but there aren't going to be quote unquote winners and losers as part of the process. It's an important part of reform that you have to start with that everybody is mapped from a current position to a new place in a new system. There are a handful of principles that we're trying to use in the system. One is simplification. Our system is very complex. People have talked for at least 30 years about the enormous number of job classifications. Job classification is the thing, administrator 2, attorney 4, et cetera. And there are 1,400, and we're transitioning from 1,400 to 200. We've actually done this transition, grouped in 22 major occupational groups. So we're simplifying the system to make it easier to understand for everybody inside and outside. Standardization, our system is New Hampshire specific. Everything is New Hampshire specific. We used to have a job title called Administrator to the Personnel Appeals Board. There aren't lots of those everywhere in the country because we have a Personnel Appeals Board. Other people don't. So we're using nationally normed groups. The national standards that are done routinely and regularly by the feds are called standard occupational classifications. You'll sometimes hear people talk about SOC. And the advantage of the SOCs is that they link to publicly available and regularly updated employment data. Things about positions, things about vacancies, things about compensation, so that there is publicly available data we link to. Because we use nationally normed, nationally standardized things, we can link to them. We don't have to guess. One of the things people know is that every time the state does a classification study, which most recently we did based on the 2019 system, we spent an enormous amount of time hiring a consultant to look at things and say, who do we compare this person to? Who do we compare this person to? And how does that look like? We'll have nationally normed data that does that for us. analysis. I talked before about how we do a factor analysis to rate positions. One of the things that we don't do, we do our ratings on the basis of job content and job content alone. Something like 80% of groups that do classification use a combination of compensation and job content. And the easiest way to describe this is with nurses. You look at nurses based on job content, and you're like, you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do that, and it factors out in your labor grade 18. But there's no earthly way to hire anybody at that salary because that's not what nurses make. That may be what the job content proposes, but it's not what they make. And so this, what we're proposing is adding a compensation factor to the job content, which is to say that we analyze based on what it would actually cost to hire people who do that for a living. And so it would be one of the factors.
Question, Representative Popovici Muller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking the questions. I was going to ask when you started talking about the budget neutral, but then I saw the, this point on the slide a bit later, and I figured it fits better here. You are saying that right now with the remapping, no employee salary will change. Completely understood. But obviously, based on the changes in here, we would expect changes in compensation to occur over the long term because we would have better data and the different classifications to adjust. Somebody may come in with their current salary and be at the high end or at the low end of a range, so they would either move up more slowly or faster depending on where they are in the new range and so on. Would it be fair to say that while right now it's budget neutral, this reclassification will change, compensations over the long term, and that's really part of the, design goals?
It could. I want to clarify exactly how, though, because I think it's important.
Sure.
In the current system, when people think that a classification is inappropriate on the basis of recruitment or retention, our ability to hire people at that salary, we do what's called an enhancement to that classification, not to an individual position, but to an entire class of positions. And so what happens is those items are done through there's a process, and the governor's office looks at them, and Division of Personnel looks at them, and in the end they go to governor and council. We currently have something like 1,400 positions across government where there's an enhancement, and it's done through this process of enhancement. What we're proposing doing here is formalizing it in the system so there aren't 1,400 one-offs. It's hard to describe something as a one-off when there are 1,400 of them. And it's clearly a flaw for how you address that. It's not a flaw, but the presumption is that they would be very rare, and they're not very rare. So we would do that. In addition to that, in our current system, there are two other ways in which the place a position is slotted happens. Is it a labor grade 12? Is it a labor grade 26? And how does that work? If an employee or a commissioner or somebody, manager, thinks that an employee is not appropriately classified or a group, they can ask for a reclassification. I can look and I say, based on what Cassie does, we have her classified as an attorney 2. It's not actually what she does. She's more like an administrator 4 based on this, this, and this. And we would look at that. It's done often with vacant positions, and it's done less frequently with filled positions. But we would look at it, and there's a review process, and we would decide that position is not appropriately classified, and it should be X, not Y. In addition to that, you can do that with an entire group of positions, an entire classification of positions, all like positions across government. That's currently called a reallocation, where you might look at recently, for example, people are familiar with this. We did this with state troopers, where state troopers believed, based on a variety of reasons, that they were not appropriately accounted for. And there's a lot of paperwork involved, but it's done. This anticipates doing a lot of that work similarly, but doing it more explicitly as part of a factor analysis rather than separately.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for a high quality, and you know how much we like getting in the weeds when needed. It was a good time to do so.
Well,
And
I
think
try
somebody-
once in a while.
I'm all set.
Jerry's going to ask.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add to it, as the commissioner was talking about when we have these today, and I think this is a really important item to notice, is that agencies today, if they ask for a reallocation of a group of positions or a reallocation of just one, they still need to fund it within their existing budget. So when you talk about, over the long term, can things not be budget neutral? We have a process today for pay to change for a group or an individual. Agencies still have to manage within the budget that's given to them. So how do they fund it? Through vacancies or other things that have changed. But it's not that there's an additional appropriation that comes to them to manage that.
Thank you.
We have further questions. Representative Hall.
Thank you. Two questions. In the reallocation, right, for a single position, right, who is that review process going before?
There's a unit at the Division of Personnel.
Okay. And then follow up, we have a large number of positions that are hourly versus salaried within the state for
Arguably,
yeah.
all of them.
Well, there's within DHHS, 1% or something is 0.5% is salaried versus the balance that are hourly. Has there been any investigation into like managerial and higher level people being salaried versus hourly?
There's this gets a little too in the weeds on this. People will remember that in something like 2015, don't hold me to that year, there was a look, the Federal Labor Department looked at some of the way we paid people and did things. We ended up engaging a company called Littler that's very prominent in employment law to do a comprehensive audit, an audit that I think only DOJ has a copy of, and it's thousands of pages, to talk about whether some of the things we did are appropriate or inappropriate. And if you compare to the federal FLSA law, and in particular as it surrounds exempt and non-exempt employees, and whether the state is one employer or not one employer, can you work a second job within the state with it not counting as overtime? The answer is no, you can't. We had thought the answer before was yes, apparently. So that some of that happens. We have considered, in fact, our director of personnel, for example, has a thought on how to create a group of non-exempt salaried classified, if you will, positions, still eligible to join the union, still eligible to be a classified employee, but who would be functionally salaried and not unsalaried. It's a significant change, and we've had very preliminary discussions with the governor about it. And I think of it as sort of a second part of the classification reform. I would like to get there because you have an accountant making $106,000 a year. It's a little goofy that they're an hourly employee, or that they're paid as if they're an hourly employee.
Representative McGuire for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. You said there were 9 steps, and I'd like to learn a little more about those. Does someone in a new job always start at step 1? Are the differences from step 1 to step 2 always X% the same across all classifications, things like that?
There's a grid. I can actually refer you to the pay schedules are all published on our website, and for the most part in the collective bargaining agreements, I think. There may be some that are not. Functionally, the grid has, let me start a couple things about the grid. The grid has diagonal equity. So step 2 of the labor grade below is the same as step 1 of the labor grade above, and then you diagonally progress. So it's about 4% roughly in terms of a grid. It's not precisely 4%. I think some of that is over time, but generally speaking, like if you draw a diagonal line, you can see 42,612, 42,612, et cetera. And it's why when someone is promoted in the system, there's a diagonal path that they take. You go diagonally to their new salary and then up one to get them where they were. How do people start is a good question. In theory, you're meant to start at step 1, work your career, and at the end of, I think it's 12 years that it would take you to progress all 9 steps. The early steps are 1 year. The later steps are 2 years, and the final step is 3 years. And in theory, that's how it would work. That presumes a world in which people take a job and stay in the same company for a very, very, very long time. It's not actually the world we live in anymore. You know, my dad worked for General Motors for 40 years. It's unlikely I'm going to work for anybody for 40 years unless I stay in this job till I'm 100, which seems unlikely. It'd be hard to get reappointed, I think, at 96. and it depends on the climate, right? In some, when the labor market is quite loose, it's much easier for us to hire everybody who applies to step one. When the labor market is very tight, like it is today, the hopes of attracting anybody, and frankly, because of where wages are, the hopes of attracting anybody to step one is difficult. I want to hire somebody and they're, you already make more than I could hire you at step five. So there's a process where you request a waiver for hiring at a higher step.
Follow up?
Thank you. So the 10 and 2% COLAs here are supplemented by annual step increases of roughly 4%. Is that right?
Yes, although later in your career, it's 2 years, or the final year, 3 years. And of course, if you're step nine, you're just out of luck. And I think the theory behind the two different things, the one is for longevity and experience, and the other is for the cost of living, is I think how it's been explained to me in the past.
How much effect is there on span of control? One person supervises 3, another supervises 10. Does that make a difference?
If you think about the rating factors, and I mentioned earlier what some of the rating factors are, the idea behind that is to get at job complexity. When I say job content, a big piece of that is complexity. And it's your impact on other employees and your impact on the state enterprise as a whole. And so there are ways to look at that. And it's why, we come up with point totals, but there's a subjective quality to it. In theory, somebody who supervises 10 people is likely going to have a higher score on that ranking than somebody who supervises 3. I don't say that there aren't cases where the person who supervises 3 has a higher rating because of what he or she is also doing. But in theory, 10 is likely to yield you more points, if you will, than 3.
How did the national standards evolve? I hope that's not from the feds.
Well, they did evolve from the feds, and if you look back at the way the federal government works, frankly, when we developed our system in 1950, there was a lot of work done. We had a consultant, I think, from New Jersey, who was very active in the Council on State Governments, who had developed model legislation on classification reform. Classification reform. I said the thing about Garfield getting killed, right, by a disgruntled job seeker. And it's what led to, President Arthur imposing a civil service system. And then it was the Social Security amendments in the 30s, Governor Murphy here at the time, who imposed a classification system. But in 1950, there's a lot of work because most of the states were adopting them in the 30s and 40s, and they wanted to do something much more scientific. If you look at that legislation, there are all kinds of charts in it and all of that. The same thing happened federally, and they did a lot of work. There have been 3 or 4 periods of significant personnel reform at the federal level. One was during the Reagan administration when Don Devine was director of the Office of Personnel Management. One was during the Clinton administration when Al Gore had a commission, which I think was called something like Reinventing Government. And whether you think Al Gore is more progressive than you would wish or more conservative than you would wish, there's a lot of really good data in that many hundreds of pages of report. So they come out of that, and one of the ideas was to create a system of measuring things, and it's both SOC and then the ONET database, which helps tell if it's doing a good job. So it did come out of the feds, but after significant reform.
You certainly study history.
I'm trying to learn my job well. It's my goal. It's not working every day. On decisions, I'll just close on this slide. Our idea is to have more information to make more decisions. Exactly what that means doesn't mean that anything will necessarily be adjusted. And it doesn't mean just because we think, it's possible we'll find that the entire state is 8.5% below, on average below. And what some states that have done things like this, they'll have like an auditor or someone like that do a list of positions that are particularly anomalous and work with either the legislature or some other mechanism to reform them. So it's information with which to make decisions. Okay. Moving on to recruitment and retention. This is a big challenge for everybody here, right?
Representative Edwards has a question.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Erlinghouse. I just want to make sure that my big epiphany during this briefing is accurate, that we're sort of burying the lead a little bit because people keep talking about the 10% and the 2% because the money is so important. But it seems like slide 7 under simplification, this is really the headline of what's going on. We have massive transition and reform of our personnel classification system that's in what? All of this is in HB2, the transition?
Most of it isn't in HB2. Most of it is, if you think of governance, the Division of Personnel is tasked with doing a classification system.
Okay,
And
so you have
most
the
of what they do
authority
is
to
not in
redo the
HB2.
classification system without additional legislation, and you're currently undergoing a massive amount of reclassification work. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate.
Thank you.
If it were not budget neutral, we would have we would have to interact significantly with House Bill 1 and House Bill 2. But that's a piece of it. Recruitment and retention, which, so we talked about the 10%, which is a big part of recruitment and retention. But it's worthwhile saying as a preface that in the past, the state was a destination employer. Sherry came up with that phrase, which I think is right. A number of employees who are, I was going to say who are older than I am, but including some who are younger than I am, because I appear to be aging, will say, you hear people talk all the time. My goal was to get into the state system. And, you know, my father always told me that's where you need to do. You need to try to get into the state system. It's a good place to be. And it's been like that for a long time. And there are a number of employees who want to work here, want to both start and end their career here. But they're fewer and far between. Times really have changed. People don't work at General Motors for 50 years. People don't work at a lot of places for 50 years. What we have to do is continually realign our policies to actively draw candidates to the state. It's what we look at and it's what we do. How do we attract talent to the state? The state is not just an employer. It's not just somebody who has people on payroll. The state has lots and lots of people on payroll doing enormous things that the entire working for the people of the state of New Hampshire that they rely on. And there's a lot of work and there's a lot of interaction with lawmakers and other policymakers to ensure that things happen. In a transparent way, to ensure that policies are being followed. It's a privilege, but an enormous responsibility. And to do that, we have to attract good talent to the state. And I think, you know, this committee more than most sees the results of that. When we have good people, very good things happen. When we don't, they don't. So there are a lot of things that we do. And so the first thing I'm going to mention is my favorite thing, because this was my idea and I fought very hard for this, which is to eliminate the barrier dismissed by degrees as the academic research on this, where you create artificial employment barriers to hire. You create, if you have a degree, if you don't have a BA, you can't possibly have this job. I don't care if you have 20 years of experience. You didn't actually complete your degree. So we allow experience and education to be supplemented with each other. This is a significant reform that I think other states are now following as well. We're very, very happy about this, and it allows us to attract talent we might not otherwise have been able to talent and to attract and to retain people we might not otherwise be able to retain based upon their ability to do the job, as opposed to having taken the requisite number of English literature courses. We see increasing use of promotional paths. I think the new system will allow for more promotional paths. And one way to think about this is we have something like 66 different promotional paths in state government right now. But think of it as a bank examiner 1, 2, 3, 4. Somebody gets better and better at their job, and they rise in that path. They're promoted within their position. They gain the experience to do a better job, and they don't have to leave to increase their compensation. They can stay here and do so. We established a statewide recruitment unit, which is ARPA funded, but to consult with and assist every agency to identify obstacles and help agencies and hiring managers improve hiring practices. One of the obstacles in hiring is that hiring managers are managers. They're not hiring managers. They weren't trained. We didn't hire them because of their ability to hire. We hired them because of their ability as an accountant, as an engineer, as an attorney, as an administrator. And yet they're also being asked to do hiring, which, as any manager would tell you, the biggest obstacle is hiring is that I have to do my job and hire on the side. And so what we've done is try to identify best practices and improve things and look at things. You've got 162 people who've waited more than 30 days to be contacted after they've applied for the job. That's not working. In this climate, none of those people are going to work for you because they all took another job already. And so we work with them and identifies ways to do that. I think that's going very well. We're going to enhance the state's online presence for recruitment. We've done some of this in the past, particularly with Indeed, but there are a bunch of things, some of which I am very familiar with, some of which I'm not. I never heard of Handshake before, but apparently people who look for work have heard of Handshake before and know a great deal about it. And the idea is to go to people where they are, not the old-fashioned state method is that if you post it, they will come. You post a job, people come see it. That's just not how it works. And then there are the ARPA-funded recruitment and retention incentives, which I think for the agencies that received them were found to be beneficial. I would hasten to add, though, that very, very few people in the percentage basis had access to those retention bonuses. So it didn't necessarily affect them.
Question, Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you promote the quality of life in New Hampshire? Do you have programs like that to try to get people from out of state to come here?
I don't want to say that we have a formal promotion of the quality of life program. It's not like it's a separate thing. But I think that when we're recruiting candidates, we talk about it a lot. And I'll use as an example. The committee knows that for our department, I do a final interview on everybody we hire, and it's more than 100 people a year. And I would say about half of them were born in New Hampshire, and half of them came to New Hampshire from somewhere else, including me. And the quality of life in New Hampshire is an enormous attraction to a job here. And I don't want to second guess that. That's a big thing. I think New Hampshire itself is a great place to go. And we want people who have decided to go here to also want to work for the state as well.
We have further questions, one from Representative Wallner, then one from Representative Emmerich.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the ARPA incentives that we were able to give, specifically around what types of jobs received those incentives and sort of what the range of the incentives were?
Sherry actually has a list, which thank God, because I didn't bring one with me. But I want to, as a big picture item, they tended to be mostly jobs at 24/7 facilities. If you think of corrections, veterans home, New Hampshire Hospital, et cetera, and not for the most part, not for most employees. Do you want to hit what they are?
Sure.
Summary.
So I can provide more detail because I do have a pretty good handout that has information on it. But just to give you a sense of a few things, one of the early on incentive programs, as the commissioner mentioned, was direct care institutional. So think of veterans home, safety, corrections, New Hampshire Hospital, Glencliff. A lot of that was if you work directly with clients, or I should say with patients or residents. That was a $2,000 one-time payment for full-time. Part-time was $500. There was some parameters in terms of timing. In terms of number of them.
We can send the committee,
Yeah.
Sherry has a summary sheet, which we can share with the committee.
So just to give you some ranges, so that, around 1,300 individuals received that. Then we had anything from, and I think of that more as retention. It's an existing employee, but then there was also ones that were, I'll call them signing bonuses to try to attract a new hire. So correctional officers and troopers. So think of sworn officers in both of those agencies. They had $10,000 signing bonuses. That was not as large of numbers. There was around 15 new hires in each of those. So a smaller category there. Also for safety and corrections, you had a bonus for existing
Okay, taking over. Somebody pick up the flag. Okay, hang on. My eyesight isn't what it once was. Employee retention incentives at the Veterans Home for non-direct care workers, one-time payment of $2,000 full-time. Safety, retention incentives to full-time state and police fire and safety sworn personnel. Safety, recruitment incentive to new full-time state personnel. The retention was 5,000, the new is 10,000. Corrections, retention incentives to existing full-time sworn correction personnel, 5,000. Corrections, recruitment incentives to new full-time sworn correctional personnel, 10,000. And then transportation had a winter maintenance thing. If you agreed to be part of the winter maintenance on call for that, it's $2,500, which I gather was very helpful for them in the winter. So that's the big stuff.
What period do you have to work to qualify for the sign-in bonus? I mean, you can't sign in, get the bonus, and then leave in 6 months.
No, but do you remember?
It should be right on here. It's about 6 months that you had to stay.
I think it was 6 months. It wasn't you just get it, but I think it's 6 months that you had to stay. I can look into that and get that to you. Okay. I think we lost Sherry.
He canceled his question.
Oh, good. Okay.
Representative Edwards has one.
Thank you. I want to come back to Representative Hull's question. I think one of the things that triggered Division 3 wanting to have this conversation with you, it was the observation that DHHS only has 2%, 3% of their total workforce in a salaried position. And that just seems odd, given everyone's experience with the commercial corporate world. It's a very, very, very low percentage. And I know you answered this in part, but what I was looking to hear is to what extent does the department control its own destiny? To what extent can it be initiating a job relook for positions that really ought to be salaried and are currently listed as hourly?
They don't. We live in a union environment, so they don't. I mean, the short answer is they don't control their own destiny at all. To back up a step, there are something like across state government 384-ish positions. Don't hold me to that, but I think it's the right number, that are unclassified. And historically, those were meant to only be the division head and the deputy in a division. So in 1950, there were like 45 or something like that. And over time, it increased. HHS in the mid-90s, when Terry Morton was commissioner, established a set of positions, something like 90, where he received permission in the legislature to convert 95 positions forcibly from classified to unclassified positions with a set of rules around them. That's the only time that's really happened. Typically, positions that are converted one-off by the legislature. They can only be converted in a piece of legislation or established unclassified in a piece of legislation. We currently exist in a world where almost all of the civil service of the state of New Hampshire is paid as if they're hourly. And I use that phrasing because I think the DOJ likes that, because we're not 100% compliant exactly necessarily with FLSA. To take a bunch of those positions, let's just say for the sake of argument, the highest labor grade positions, and to turn them, or the most managerial positions, and to turn them into salaried positions would require a negotiation with the union. Which union, depending on which agency you're talking about. With HHS, it would be with the SEA, and so that would require, because we're a union shop, if you will, it would require some discussion with the SEA and would have to be bargained. So to that extent, they do not control their own destiny in that respect.
Representative McGuire for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So retention is extremely important. We found out recently in a discussion with your office that fewer than 50% of Group 1 state employees reach their 10th anniversary, right? So get vested, right? I mean, so this is a big problem. Can you develop some performance metrics so that we can know over time whether this is getting better or worse? And especially, this could be a societal sort of issue, right? I mean, it could be younger people have different ideas of long-term employment versus others, older people, things like that. So I think we need some kind of metrics to say we're doing better, we're doing worse, et cetera. Yeah.
We so we track, as people probably know, the Division of Personnel publishes an annual report, which is mostly a statistical report, and they exist on our website going back to 2003, and I'm sure there's hard copies longer ago than that. Not that anybody wants them, but that report has always had in it a list of separations from state service. And one of the metrics that they check on it is separations over time, which is why we had that discussion about 50%. What we will do, frankly, whether we decide to or not, we'll track that every year on a sort of an annualized basis on where they are. I think your point about societal change, though, is important. I really do think we live in a world where people expect to look. I think if you were to talk to the average 35-year-old, let's say, he or she has his resume perpetually updated and keeps an updated copy of their resume on their computer and updates it every so like 6 years ago, the governor decided to nominate me for my current position. And somebody said to me, I need a resume. And I said, are you sure? Because I hadn't done a resume in almost 20 years. And I didn't have one. I went and found one in an old version of Microsoft Works. And just to give you an idea, and it didn't have like my last 2 or 3 positions. And the one person, who I will argue was younger than I am, said, what are you kidding me? Your resume should be updated every time you get a promotion, change jobs, whatever. How do you not have one on your? I'm like, I don't know, I just didn't. But I think it really is a generational thing where I suspect if I surveyed people who work in our agency, that probably everybody under the age of 50, 40 anyway, has a resume on their home computer. And I think that's probably not going to get better.
Representative Mooney for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. On the other end of the hiring spectrum, I'm curious, is there an average retirement age for state employees?
I don't know that we have an average. I would say that to the extent that there is, it's increasing in terms of retirement. The changes over the last about 10 years have affected the number of years you have to stay to qualify for retiree health, which for current workers is more like 20 instead of 10. It means people are more likely to work until they're 65. The cost of health care drives a lot of those decisions, as anybody who is at or near retirement age is thinking about how much health care is going to cost. When I was 25, I didn't care how much healthcare costs at all, and that seems to have changed in my life. But the cost of the premium cost of retiree health, if you're under 65, is significantly higher than it was 10 years ago. So we're seeing more and more people stay until 65. But I think 65 is still one of those psychological things. Social security age for people in their 50s is probably 67, normal Social Security age. But nonetheless, 65 is when you get Medicare, and I think people look at that and it makes a big difference.
Representative Murray for a question.
Thank you. I'm learning a lot about this thing with salaried versus hourly, and I'm very, very surprised at some of this just coming out of my own experience. Let me put the question this way. Would you find that you might lose someone's interest in a job because it's an hourly position as opposed to a salaried position?
I think the opposite is true, oddly. I think that in terms of conversion, we've talked a lot about conversion because I agree that we should have a salary classified band of positions. But today, for most of those positions, most of the state is a 37.5 hour work week. And if you work a 38th hour, we must, under FLSA, pay you extra for it. So in terms of doing that, if I convert you from hourly to salary, one of the questions you ask yourself is, well, if I'm averaging 8 hours of overtime, what are you paying me now? And one of the things you would have to do, because you would naturally, people who are in a FLSA salaried category are going to work something like 40 to 50 hours a week. And so you would have to convert their salary from 37.5 to 40 and then make that your new salaried base. And so that becomes an issue. But I don't think we're losing people the other direction.
Thank you again. Just so that I'm clear again, and again, I'm coming from a different tradition. What you refer to as promotional paths, would I possibly interpret that as merit increases? Because when you're looking at the salaried position and you're going above and beyond, the 80-hour week, there is compensation for that, and can be, more significant than what states would ever go for. But is that promotional path is your concept of merit increases?
It's not. The difference is merit increases tend to be on the basis of some sort of judgment that's made by a manager. Somebody decides, there's somebody who's in charge of deciding how much you get and how much you get and how much you get, and whether you get something or whether you don't get something. In the state system, and again, we're both a civil service system and a unionized system. Everything is done by rule. And what you would have to do is establish specific objective criteria on the basis of which somebody would go from a CPSW 1 to a CPSW 2. You received this, you did this, and it's not on the basis of a judgment call on the basis of a supervisor.
Follow up.
Thank you. Last one. So if you're really, really good at what you do, how are you compensated? How do you express to the person that they're doing an absolutely fabulous job?
Verbally. You do everything you can. It's actually a really good question. That not financially. The system does not allow, and again, it's a system of rules and a system of a union contract, and there's nothing specifically designed for that. It means that if you're a manager and you're trying to retain talent, it's something I think about almost literally every day. One of the things that you have to do is use non-financial cues and appreciations and do your best not to be a jerk. And that's a big thing. I mean, it sounds flippant, right? But not being a jerk is remarkably important.
We'll always quote you on that. Representative Popovici Mueller for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is on earned time, but just as a quick side note on what Representative Murray was talking about, this has been one of my frustrations in my 3 negotiations with public sector unions that I've been in New Hampshire, that they seem to be very resistant to the concept of any form of merit pay. But this is something that obviously will have to be dealt with any individual contract negotiation and so on. My question was based on the fact that I used to work for the town of Windham, and we had made certain changes in the earned time policy that led from us being overly generous to, some would say, a bit overly less than generous. How do you feel the state policies on time off, earned time, vacation, and so on are in terms of our ability to attract and retain employees?
I would start by saying that if you used to work for the town of Windham, I want to thank you because we stole one of your best employees and made her our comptroller, and somebody to whom I am every day trying to offer non-financial cues to keep her from leaving. So that's something. Are we generous? Are we not generous? I would say this on wages, the state does not keep up well, and I think everybody knows that. Just in terms of the actual salaried or wage compensation, we do not necessarily keep up well. We have extraordinary benefits, and I'm not saying that just because it's my department that administers the health benefit package, but we have a very good, very well administered, and a very an above average healthcare plan. And it means if you're an employee for whom healthcare is important, if I'm honest, that tends to be older, not younger, right? That's an advantage. In terms of time off, I think we have a generous time off policy. Our time off, if you compare us to other public sector employers, cities, towns, counties, et cetera, it may not be as generous as some towns tend to do better than the state does. But if you compare us to the private sector, we are generous. This came up in our comp study. They're generous. We have personnel policies that basically keep managers from not letting you take your time off. I mean, there are obviously some things you have to do, but if you earn your time off, you're entitled to take it, and I think we stick with that. And I think in that respect, I think it's actually one of the advantages that attracts you to the state is work-life balance.
Thank you. And just for the record, you guys making Dana an offer she couldn't refuse was a spectacularly wise decision. Thank you.
We agree.
Okay, members, we're about to wrap this up. Representative Hull for a question.
Thank you, Chairman. As a follow-up to both Edwards and Murray, I guess, if you have an employee and you want to do more than, quote, not be a jerk, unquote, and and there's an interest on the part of the employee at becoming salaried, right? Contrary to the data you just shared, that's an interest as opposed to hourly. You're still going back to the union even for a one-off to make a change, or is this only when you're trying to do a reclassification of an
Well, no, to make a change, to change the terms and conditions of employment in a union situation, you have to negotiate with the union. That's just a thing. And it's not about whether we agree or don't agree. It's not about whether everybody's on board with it. It's that it's a requirement of the structure, the fact that we are organized as a collective bargaining unit, that we have to do that. There are, in terms of one-offs, there are occasional changes, and the legislature is familiar with this, where a position here or a position there. Our chief financial officer, for example, used to be a classified position, and it is not. Those changes have to go through legislation, and it's part of that process. Frankly, and I think part of that is to allow the employee a chance to object. But in terms of, if you and I agree, and you say, just pay me salaried, well, our system doesn't actually allow for that.
Thank you. What we haven't.
The only last slide was on the hiring process, because I know people talked about it, and there was a great deal of information that was presented to the Division 3 a few weeks ago that wasn't entirely in every particular, strictly speaking, correct. And so I mentioned that in case the committee wanted to talk about that. We have made a lot of improvements over the last 3 or 4 years to the hiring process in terms of streamlining it and making it easier to understand and more accessible. We have a long way to go in this respect. Everybody has a long way to go in this respect. And a significant change will include the next generation of the state's ERP. But I would just mention a couple things. There was some discussion that perhaps if you apply for a job on Indeed, it doesn't go to the job on the state's website. That's incorrect. Something I actually looked at myself directly with my staff. We went on the internet, went to Indeed. Occasionally you'll hear things from employees who've not actually done a task themselves and will have heard something from somebody else that's not, strictly speaking, correct. And so I wanted to bring that up in addition. In addition, people have talked about how perhaps you have to post a job using some of the archaic classification titles. That hasn't been true in decades. And almost every agency in the state does not do that because it's much easier to hire a vendor contract manager than it is to hire an administrator too. And if you're actually posting a job that says administrator too, you're making a mistake. And so we do a lot in that respect we try to work with agencies. This is actually one of the goals of the recruitment unit, because even within agencies, there are some people who are particularly good at figuring out how to hire a position well, and there's some people who are less. And our idea is to try to use anything the Department of Labor learns to help the Department of Insurance, and anything the Department of Insurance learns to help the Department of Employment Security. There are 42 state agencies, depending a little bit on how you count, and our goal is to help all of them in every respect, because they're all important. But happy to answer any questions on any of that or anything else.
Thank you. One of the things that I think we've observed that sit on the Finance Committee, both of your deputies we have seen in other agencies, and obviously that's a way. We also see a constant change in LBA people that get trained and then move on to other agencies, and we forever see them coming back in other roles, always dealing with finance, of course, as your deputies do. But it isn't wide open. I guess it enables people to shift from one job within state to another fairly easily without a lot of, problems and saying, well, you haven't filled a full year yet or any of that stuff. You can move fairly easily, which seems to be more help in being flexible in the job. So
I think it's actually very important for the state system to allow people to move from agency to agency. It creates an enormous situation. It happens that the two of them both spend a great deal of time at HHS. And this committee's seen them over many years in many capacities. But I would say this, that I benefit from having great employees, one of whom used to work in the town of Wyndham, two of whom used to work at HHS. But otherwise, you'd have to rely upon my judgment rather than theirs. And you are much better off relying on their judgment than mine.
And one of the things we saw for years is not every agency has a deep bench, so that you got people lined up to replace as people move up. And many agencies don't have that, especially if they're not dealing much with finance and they have one financial person. Where you're going to get that replacement from? Obviously somewhere else in the state government. So I'm glad we have that flexibility because it seems to work out. Any other questions from the members? Seeing none. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, very enlightening, and I can't believe how much you dig into history.
I'm happy to be here anytime. Thank you.
All right, we'll close that hearing. And we next are going to have a hearing on HB 49A. And I guess Representative Edwards and perhaps Representative Lynn are going to make presentations.
I'm not sure of the right order to do this, Mr. Chair. I have two amendments. We can discuss either, but maybe it would be better to start with a discussion on 0738. That's
Okay,
two.
we have something else. Representative Irv.
There are two subs here.
All right, Mary Jane, would you go to the mic?
We have three Democrats who are not here today, and Connie Lane, Representative Lane, and Representative Schultz are going to sit in for them. Thank you.
So you have two of three replacements.
I have two of three, yes.
Thank you. All right, Representative Edwards, continue.
Yes, sir. I would like to move consideration on amendment to House Bill 49. The bill number is 2023-0738 Hotel. It's a relatively short bill that focuses strictly on the financial aspects of the Sununu replacement, as well as making sure that we prioritize ARPA money and we begin to go get a contractor.
Right, I guess we're all getting distributed that amendment. Thank you.
I'll second that motion.
All right, a motion and a second to accept the amendment. We're open for discussion. This is just a work session, so it's, at best, it's going to be a straw vote.
I'll wait for people to look over the amendment. Is that all right, sir?
Certainly. All right, why don't we discuss the changes to the original bill?
All right, thank you. Just a little bit of history. The Sununu Replacement Center has been an ongoing issue for a couple of years at least. And in the current session, The Senate passed SB 1 24 to nothing. SB 1 had an appropriation in it, had a lot of detail about what the Sununu Replacement Center, how it should look and feel from an operations perspective, how it should be co-located and leverage shared facilities and the like. And when it came over to the House was not able to pass SB 1. I was reminded oftentimes during that effort that we are a finance committee, we are not a policy committee, and that SB 1 had policy issues in it that was greater than what our committee ought to be looking at. So we did pass some of SB 1 on a very fast timeline to keep the facility from closing prematurely on 1 March. We did appropriate some money. We did appropriate some money for operations and for the ability to go do a site selection process. We created a committee or commission to work with the local community. So I think we did maybe 15 to 20% of SB 1 what it wanted to do. But we left some major parts laying on the ground. And one of the major parts was we did not appropriate the construction and we did not tie up the Gopher and ARPA money. What this bill does is it keeps finance and finance's lane and just deals with those two aspects of the financial situation.
Further questions from committee members? Representative Irf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you just, so when we had a meeting of divisions 3 and 1 a few weeks back and put forth an amendment, this is not that amendment, correct?
This is not. I started with this because there was a typo in the amendment you're referring to, and that I think is now available. But nevertheless, logically, I thought it would be better today, since this is a work session, to build up from ground zero. You're right. Division 1 and 3 did on a 10-5 vote pass a version of an amendment.
So I'm just trying to understand how this amendment relates to that amendment.
This is a different amendment. This is an amendment that only deals with the finance aspects. Division 2 has not heard any of this yet. This is just the financial consequences of us trying to complete our work on the Sununu Replacement Center.
Okay.
If you would prefer, we could.
Here's my question. It looks like there's some stuff in here that also was in there. Is that just a misunderstanding on my part? Like the numbers, the 21.6 million?
I don't remember exactly the extent to which the numbers are the same. I think that the $21.6 million number has been floating around for a while. So if it's the same number from what Division 1 and 3 did, that would make sense to me. I think that's where we were. There's been so many amendments on this, Representative Irf, that I can't remember everything that we've talked about and when we talked about it.
So are we going to see that one as well, or not going to see that one?
I think we can see that one. This is we're having a discussion on what this is, and this is the bare bones, nothing but finance version of an amendment that would, I think, complete the House's work in 2023 on the Sununu Replacement Center. We can do more.
No. Now I get it. Thank you.
Okay.
Representative Griffin for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for taking my question, Representative. Is this still an 18 bed facility?
It would not change what's in SB 1. In SB 1, it says that the site selection should be looking at two options. It should be looking at an option that is a 6 to 12 facility, or another option that staffs at as though the residents were at 12, operationally staff at 12, but with a physical capacity at 18. So that's a long answer to your question is yes.
Now, I went back and looked at the women's prison, It cost $38 million. It serviced 224 beds, I believe. That comes out to about $170,000 a bed. This comes out to something over $1 million a bed. And there's no way in my mind I can justify the kind of money that's being put on the table here. Thank you.
Representative Edwards.
I think that's a fine financial observation. I would just, point out just a few things that would bear on your observation. One is that the bonding of the women's prison took place a number of years ago, and just even in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of inflation. Also, this is intentionally, explicitly not a prison. This is a continuation of the juvenile mental health and behavioral health system. The point of this facility is not incarceration. It's to get away from an incarceration model and instead replace it with a trauma-informed, I keep forgetting the terminology, but basically being sensitive to the fact that these kids probably need some mental health counseling more than they need to be in a prison environment. So we're building something different than what you saw before.
Representative Popovici Miller and then Representative Hull.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Having just recently visited the current facilities, I just wanted to say I cannot comment on whether the amount of dollars is right or not. That will take a much deeper dive. But I would say that I don't think we should compare this with, again, pure incarceration facilities, because this center, the whole root of the problems was that it was originally treated as just incarceration, and it created a lot of issues. There is much more that we need to do for the very few minors that will end up in those places. They need very specialized care. And again, while I cannot comment on whether this amount is appropriate or not, I would urge us to use a different baseline because it is a very different type of facility. Thank you.
Representative Hull for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize. I stepped out, so you may have covered this. This is a work session only. There's a plan, I believe, to have a follow-up work session and executive session.
That's true.
And then secondly, in terms of germaneness on amendments, right? Because we're back to the original bill. I know that one of the amendments that's been drafted has been looked at and has been ruled effectively non-germane. We'll have a hearing on that. When do we know where that line is between a bill that was relative to postponing the closure of the Sununu Center to one that is now discussing finances or any other changes of law? Do we have to have all of these go through that hearing next week as non-germane since the date's already been pushed out via SB1?
We will have to determine on the amendment after the committee hears it, whether it's non-germane or not and appropriate to the line of questioning we've had. We obviously had to do something or the Sununu Center would be closed by now. Then we also have to follow up on the financing of the replacement. And obviously this Gopher money came available, but it had a deadline. So there's some urgency on operating on that deadline and make certain that we have the finance lined up and we're ready to construct. We'll leave it up to Public Works to how efficient or how well designed it is, and we don't have that design yet. So those are the things we have to look at. But if we decide it's germane after we've heard the next amendment at the next public hearing, then we may incorporate it. Otherwise, we may go ahead with what we already have before us.
Okay.
So, but we've got to get something done within our deadlines.
Thank you.
Representative Tulersky for a question.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I'm just curious. I'm trying to remember through the details of Senate Bill 1 and then taking this amendment into account. If Representative Edwards could clarify if this amendment also moves through, who would then be the decision maker for both the site and the ultimate size of the facility? or is that something that would be coming down the road?
Thank you for the question. When you look at Amendment 0738 before you, if you look at the end of line 10, reading on to line 12, the department may use the final report of the commission established in RSA 169, blah, blah, in order to finalize the capacity and site selection of the replacement center. So this moved it in previous versions that you saw where it said governor and council, that was being floated. This language came directly from the governor's office. This was their request for what we do with this piece of legislation. And throughout this process, I've been trying to figure out how we can say yes to each other. So I took the governor's requested language and included it in here.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Okay, we have two other co-sponsors in the room, and I'd like to recognize and see if they have anything they'd like to add. Representative Lynn may have to get back to another committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And members of the committee, I guess I may be a little bit at a loss if the non-germane amendments that you're talking about discussing at another meeting pertain to what I've sort of referred to maybe colloquially as the former House Bill 254, that is dealing with who can be committed for what. If that's the subject of the non-germane amendment, then maybe I should wait until to discuss it later. But I'm not sure if that is what you're talking about.
That's the amendment that the House Clerk has decided was non-germane and requested we have a separate hearing on that. So that's what's been scheduled.
That was really the main thing that I was here to sort of talk about. But I'm happy to do that, at whenever you have the next hearing.
Thank you. Representative Erf, when's the date of the hearing? We're going to get a straw poll on the acceptance of what we've got so far. And then once I have that understanding amongst all of us, then we look at the final HB 49. We'll make a decision as to the germaneness of it by this committee. And then if that's the instance, we'll either use it and incorporate it and vote on one time on the bill with all the amendments, or we will vote on the bill without the so-called non-germane amendment, which we haven't judged yet to be non-germane. Representative Erf.
So I think the question that Representative Lynn is asking is, are we talking about the other amendment? And it sounds like Representative Edwards has one as well. Are we discussing all these amendments today? Or are we waiting until after the public hearing related to the non-germane one before we discuss anything else?
Since we don't have that amendment before us that I believe that three of the people here have all worked hard on, we don't have it before us at this point.
We do. We have it here.
Well, since the clerk has said we need to have a hearing, I think it's more appropriate that we have the hearing and let everybody know that may want to have input, and then have the discussion of the one that's been told we need to have a separate hearing for. So that's what I'd like to proceed.
That's fine with me, Mr. Chair. And I assume there'll be notice of when the hearing is, and I'll appear there, and that's I'm fine with
Do
that.
we have a date on that, Representative Erf?
A week from Wednesday.
A week from Wednesday.
Week from Wednesday. Okay.
15th.
The 15th.
Okay.
All right. What time? 10 a.m.
I'll be there. Thank you.
All right. And Representative Leishman, did you want to comment on this amendment?
I do support this amendment.
Thank you. Representative Wallner?
I got my question answered. I wanted to know when the non-germane amendment was going to be heard. I do want to ask, though, it would seem like we would want to hear the non-germane amendment and this one work on this one and the non-germane amendment together, incorporating it into one amendment and not a bunch of separate little amendments.
How many other members would like to see that other amendment today? Raise your hand.
Which amendment?
The one that's been judged non-germane. All right. Is it available? Mr. Ripple, is it available?
I have it. I didn't print out hard copies because I thought it wouldn't be heard by the committee until next week, but I can do that and have them available shortly.
Just people want to have it to look at. We're not going to discuss it till the public hearing, but so anybody can see what's in it and get a chance to read it, because I think it's about 5 pages, 9 pages. So it's fairly voluminous. So, Representative Stringham.
Yes, thank you for this amendment and for your clarification on lines 10 through 12. Question on the amount and the timing, like you're putting it in this year's budget, the 21.6 million. In part, I thought the total need may be less than 21 million, depending on the final design. So, and I believe HB2 has a number less than 21. I think it's 10 million appropriated for this purpose. So, why should we put 21.6 million out of this year's budget for this purpose? What do we gain by that, rather than putting it in the next biennium budget? And any comment on the differences with HB2? Thank you.
It might be because of the amount of money that's available through the federal funding that's going to go away. Representative Edwards, you want to add to that?
Yes, sir. 2 things. One, this language also came straight from the governor's office. It's an enhancement of what we had read previously, and it tries to tighten up and clarify our desire to have this as much as possible federally funded. To the issue of the 21.6 million estimate, Mr. Ribson is in the room. He might be a more authoritative person to speak to that than I am.
Mr. Ribson is Director Ribson is recognized.
Good morning. Still, yes, good morning. Joe Ribson, Director, DCYF. Thank you for hearing from me. The $21.6 million estimate is the estimate that DAS Public Works provided for the cost of building the replacement facility. My understanding is that the thinking behind the way that the budget in HB2 is crafted, that has $10 million in general funds, the idea was that that would be, I believe, in addition to what was anticipated to be $15 million through ARP. So that's gets you actually to 25 million total. That being said, 21.6 is the agreed upon number at this point that that Public Works has put forward as the cost for creating a replacement facility.
And my recollection is we had Mr. Cupper from Public Works saying you couldn't build an 18-bed for the 15 million. So he felt some of that estimate was for a 12 million, and he came before us last week, I believe, to say you needed 21 million. Representative Edwards, you had further?
So my thought on this, Mr. Chairman, is if we get this version or this amount out of the House and get some feedback from the Senate, preferably they would pass it, then we can adjust HB2, I think, appropriately to take care of Representative Stringham's observation that maybe some of this money is being double counted.
Thank you. Further from Representative Ribson, there might be questions for you. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Ribson. I agree with Representative Griffin's point that this is a very expensive facility, but in my mind, the real money here is the operational money. If you look at the original House Bill 49, it allocated $1.5 million for 3 months of operation. So we're talking about $6 million a year for operational expenses. Is that what you expect this facility, once built, to cost?
So I don't think the additional appropriation of 1.5 million is not the total cost of 3 months of operations at SYSC. That was the supplemental.
Even worse.
Right. That was the supplemental that was needed in order to close out the year, given the reduction in outside funds that used to come in through the Vermont contract, plus the extensive overtime that we're paying right now just to keep the facility safely operating, given the fact that our workforce has essentially been decimated. The information that I shared with Division 3, and I think I have some copies of it in my folder, I know Mr. Ripple has, was that we were anticipating somewhere just under $3 million a year just in personnel savings by being able to have a co-located model. So there are operational savings year after year by having a co-located model where we'd be either near in proximity with New Hampshire Hospital or Hampstead Hospital for the purpose of being able to share certain types of services and programming. You have more of an opportunity for shared services at Hampstead because in addition to kind of core functions like food, laundry, etc., you would also have the potential ability to share educational services and clinical services in a way that New Hampshire Hospital wouldn't offer a shared service opportunity. So, there's that piece of it. Then there's the cost of just maintaining this massive campus with buildings that are not in good shape, right? And the size of the facility itself. We spend $800,000 a year just in utilities on that campus that wouldn't be the same if we were to move to a smaller facility co-located elsewhere. So there are definitely operational savings to be realized year after year by moving to a co-located model. And I do think by any estimate, if you're looking at magnitudes of $3+ million a year in operational savings, that, you know, the cost of the facility is going to pay for itself in a number of years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Further questions from committee members? Seeing none. Representative Edwards.
Since this is a work session, it may have value to go ahead and bring forward the other more comprehensive amendment so that people can understand that at least between these two amendments, we have some different kinds of choices to make. There's some similarities, but there are some differences. So with your permission, I'd like to have us bring forward the second amendment.
Is that the one that was referred to as non-germane, or is it another one you have?
This is not the non-germane one. The non-germane one, it changes the criminal code. This does not.
Okay, this is one that had an
God
earlier
damn it.
vote. Is that true?
But let's hand it out. For some reason, we're just having an extremely unusual hard time having OLS and me communicate on what words they ought to be putting. We met at 9 o'clock this morning, and there's a second error, even though we met in person.
All right, we'll give Mr. Ripple time to pass it out so everybody knows what we're talking about. Thank you. Representative Hull, did you have a question while this is going on?
Thank you. Looking at 0738, right, lines 11 and following, sorry, lines 13 and following. This has to do with whether we can use ARPA funds for any of this. I'm not sure if the committee is aware. Our neighboring state of Maine is currently being sued by the ACLU of Maine for the use of just a mere $1.2 million of ARPA funds for the renovation of a facility. We should tread carefully on this. I'm not sure that that money it will be available. So I think the committee should be aware of that.
Do you recall the nature of why they're suing and what they're objecting to in the use of ARPA funds?
I can, yes, I can read the news article, right? The American Rescue Plan was intended to support local governments in responding to the impacts of COVID-19 on their communities. Although Penobscot is correct, the ARPA funds could not be used to build a new jail. It is wrong for ARPA funds to provide a blank check for all jail renovations. So they're already clear that it can't be used for a new jail. And this is a juvenile facility, not a jail. There are differences, but in some cases, there's a lot more similarities between these. I don't want the committee to blindly believe that we have this blank check available that we might not have available. So I want to bring it to the committee's attention now before we proceed.
I'll ask Representative, correction, I'll ask Director Ribson if he has any knowledge about the ARPA funds and whether or not there'd be any disagreement on how they could be used.
Hi. I think it was in Division 3 that we talked about this issue as well. I am certainly not the expert on the use of ARP funds. What I can tell you is that this is conversations that have been had with Gopher, you know, for well over a year now, when this was first being thought about last year, and it was an approved expense through their processes. But I think they would be the ones who'd be best positioned to go deep on that issue.
As far as you know, the question has been raised and dealt with.
Yes, the way that the process works is, you know, we put forward what the intended use is. They have a legal review and all types of other things that they do before they move forward. And my understanding is that that had been done and that there was funding put aside specifically for this purpose.
Thank you. Representative Irv?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is not a question for Mr. Ripson. This is just a point of information. So we have tried, and I personally, but also others, have tried to get the legal opinion from Gopher regarding this, and we've not heard from them. They also were invited to several of our work sessions, and they haven't showed up at any of them to talk about this. So we don't really have a definitive answer to the question, which I think is what Representative Hall is pointing out. Thank you.
Is there anyone present that can comment on the Gopher situation? Please come forward.
Well, I guess it's still morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Chase Hageman. I'm the Deputy Director at the Governor's Office for Emergency Relief and Recovery.
Could you spell your last name?
Hagaman.
Thank you.
So I guess I can just jump right in to the question at hand about whether ARPA state fiscal recovery funds could be used on a facility of this nature. The Gopher's opinion on this, based off of federal guidance, is that yes, it can, based on the eligibility category that we would recommend using for those funds on the facility. I don't know the nature of the lawsuit with our neighbors or what eligibility category the state may have used for their facility and use of funds, but the eligibility category for government services is a very broad one that Treasury has given quite a bit of latitude to states to use on a variety of types of facilities and expenditures, and this would qualify for it.
Thank you. Representative Hall, did you have a question for this gentleman?
Not at this time.
Thank you. Representative Irv?
Could you just provide us that written opinion so we have that for information? Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Edwards?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, then, I would like to start a conversation about the second amendment I'm bringing forward today, 2023-0757 hotel, that's been handed out. For those people who have looked at SB1 and you start to flip through this is going to look extremely and feel very familiar to you, because this is the part of SB1 that we did not pass when we did our truncated version to foreclose the closure. So this will go ahead and maintain the whole statement of findings that has been vetted numerous times. It goes on to describe who's going to be responsible for it. It goes on to describe that the facility is going to be managed by the department and not be contracted out. It describes on the second page some of the characteristics of the facility design. It talks about the facility programming and operations. So this is essentially, it talks about on the bottom of page 3, the reporting that we're expecting. In other words, this is all of the components of SB1 that we said we didn't have time to consider last time. And this is our second bite at the apple. I apologize to the committee because on page 4, lines 10 through 12, I thought we had a very specific conversation this morning that language, lines 10 through 12 about the governor and council, was to be removed and replaced with the phrase that's on 0738, that phrase being, the department may use the final report of the commission established in RSA 169 in order to finalize the capacity and site selection of the replacement center. That it was supposed to be there. I don't know why it's not, but otherwise this is a pretty good document, I think, for conversation. It's basically the rest of SB1. It's got the governor's language in there about the authority to select a version of the building, and it should have, Mr. Ripple, I'm going to look at you. It does have the same language for the gopher money at the last bottom of the sheet, right? So we're at least in sync that we got the governor's language relative to the ARPA money in here. So so that is the longer bill. I offered it if the Finance Committee had the appetite to finish the SB1 work. This will get us through all of the SB1 work. The shorter amendment was for those people who didn't have the appetite to go through all of that and wanted to see children and family law involved and wanted to see perhaps some other jurisdictions involved. The second one is merely, let's do our job and complete the finance work. So that's what I'm offering today.
Is everyone clear? We're looking at the three amendments. I'd probably do a straw vote on each of them. The first one is what's the first one here? 0738. All right, I guess it's two amendments we're looking at here. Representative Wallner.
Wouldn't we wait until we had seen the non-germane amendment at the hearing before we started taking straw votes? I mean, it's like people are trying to decide which one they prefer or like which parts of each one. So I'm suggesting that we now have two amendments before us. There's another one coming, I think, next Wednesday. And wouldn't we wait and put it all together once we've seen all the pieces?
I'm feeling they're all part of the same thing. 0758 talks about, 0738 rather, talks about can we adopt the funding while it's available? Then 0757 talks about some of the details of what's going to happen when it's built. So they're all part of the same thing without one replacing another. And then the other one we'll look at. So what I'd like to do is, if everybody's happy with the funding that we're looking at here, 0738, and the process we've heard from the gentleman from Gopher and Mr. Ribson on how this figure was derived from. It is very expensive, granted, but we don't have a lot of choice here. And if we can get a lot of this money from the federal government, it isn't something we'd have to incorporate into HB2 or HB1. So if people are satisfied with what the explanation we've heard, I'd like to do the straw vote first on 0738. So we're satisfied that there is a source of funds, there is a source of perhaps Gopher or ARPA funds that will supplant some of the state money to get this built. And it also has a deadline that we have to be aware of. Representative Hewitt.
I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm in a position to make any judgments on this. We have a different language in two different amendments. There's an old bill that is no longer being considered, I guess, and then we've got another one coming. We need to be able to put the whole thing together and see how it's going to work. Just to say that while the ARPA funds would be good or something else would be good, it's not going to do any good in terms of deciding what the heck to do. I think that before we take a straw vote, we need to know what the heck we're going to do in the final analysis, and not just take little pieces and put them down on the table and say, this is what we're going to do. I can see that as causing a great deal of commotion once we get to the point where we've seen all the moving parts put together.
How many agree with that statement by show of hands? All right, sufficient that we won't do a straw vote on these. We'll wait until next week from Wednesday, when we'll see the last amendment, where we'll have judgment of putting it all together. And I know that Mr. Ripple's looking forward to that. We can hand it out now, so people will have all these pieces together to look at and decide whether it all fits together or not. So, Representative Edwards.
So I understand what we just did, but for somebody who's been pushing this rock up the hill for 2 years, one thing that we seem to be able to do every single time is to find another reason to delay. It says these two amendments that I offered today are well within the defined terrain of everything this House has seen this year that the Senate voted on 24-0. The non-germane amendment that's being brought in at the 11th hour, dealing with the criminal code by the Finance Committee, is the exception to the process. And I'm fine. Let's wait. But I guess I'm just losing my patience for the way in which we find new ways, creative ways to delay the process. At some point, we ought to have an honest to God conversation about what we're willing to do and do it.
Representative Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my understanding that any deadline regarding use or potential use of ARPA funds is in the December 2025 timeframe. I may be wrong, but there was a discussion in Division 3. And it has to do, right, and it's not something where the additional week of discussing various options is going to put that at jeopardy. It's not like we have to commit to and use these funds by even the end of April or the end of this session, right? It's about turning the keys over to this facility to DHHS to have as operational. And then secondly, I don't know if there's a way, can Mr. Ripple put this up under the Division 3 or under the finance so other citizens can see and weigh in on this? If we're going to have a public hearing for full transparency, I think it makes sense to be that this document be allowed to be visible now, even though it's only going to come up next week. It should be something we can post as a discussion item under the LBA. He left the room though.
I don't see Mr. Ripple here now, but we can ask that he do that.
I would ask that that instead of posting 0757 that we know OLS continued the error, that we post the correct version of the amendment when it's available.
Done. Further questions? Representative Papavici Mueller and then Representative McGuire.
Just a very quick statement. I do not think that I will be comfortable in the next 3 weeks looking at any policy decisions on this. I barely don't see how we'll have the time to do the state budget, let alone start making complex policy decisions. So as far as I'm concerned, I will look at funding this, but I'm not gonna really spend a lot of time and effort, frankly, looking at last minute policy changes here. There are other committees, other places to discuss that. We have enough on our table.
Thank you. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment on 0757. On page 2, where it says the facility shall be designed to include all these things, some of these things I think may be taken care of by the co-location with the other facility at Hampstead, and maybe this should be written in such a way that the facility and the co-located other facility shall provide these things. You see what I mean? Because like I could read C and possibly G as being things that might be elsewhere and not in this facility.
For 2 years now, I've asked for people to provide written documentation on what they'd like to see in this bill, and I would be happy to take whatever language you have to offer.
Okay. I'll try to help, you know.
Mr. Ripple, while you were out, it was asked that you post this 0757 on the website, and also that you change 074, no, the other one.
Mr. Chair, if I may, to post 0746 on the website and to post 0757H as with the amendments that Representative Edwards has asked for in section, on page 4 in section, or lines 10 through 12.
Yes, he wanted that to go back to where we allow the agency to proceed with the report from the commission. So, all right, so I guess it's 0746 we're going to post, which isn't there already, and 0757 after it's corrected.
And 0746.
And 0738. 46, I think I mentioned that, yes. Okay,
Mr. Chair.
Representative Irf.
So just for clarification, to understand where 0757 came from. As I recall, when Division 1 and Division 3 met jointly, a vote was taking place of some sort. And I'm wondering, is this what we voted? Is this what was voted on that day, or is this something else?
This is 96% of that, with the changes proposed by the governor that I referred to earlier about different language around protecting the gopher money and on the final who would make the decision. So those two components are different from the 10-5 straw poll that Division 1 and 3 took.
Follow up.
Follow up.
So, and I'll just make a comment. It doesn't need to be a question, but it appears that taking those changes into this, in conjunction with the earlier amendment we heard about, the 0738, that, if I'm not mistaken, that's basically what Division 1 and Division 3 looked at and voted out of whatever that was a couple weeks ago. And just for information for the committee, this new amendment 0746 is exactly what came out of that Division 1, Division 3 meeting several weeks ago, with changes. So just so you understand that the basis of 0746 is identical to what the Division and Division 1 and 3 people looked at, with additional changes to it. But in terms of the underlying everything, the money is back in, is in here. There's some other changes about it. I guess I won't go into today. We'll wait for till next week. But you can, other than the changes that are in here, it's identical to what came out of Division 1, Division 3 a few weeks back.
Clarification on the clarification. On your page 6 of that amendment, the changes to the criminal code are included there. And I believe you subsequently had a conversation with Representative Lynn, who suggested some tweaks to that language. So while it's very close to what got discussed in that joint Division 1 and 3 work session, I don't think it's identical, is it?
That is not what I said. What I said was the basis of 0746 is identical to what was voted out of Division 1, Division 3. What I see in these other two pieces, 738 and 757, are components of that, but they are also not identical to that. And we sort of touched on some changes apparently, but not everything. I thought we were not yet discussing the 746 today because you want to wait till after the germane hearing, the non-germane hearing. So yes, you're right. There are changes in here, a number of them for sure. And I will discuss those. We will discuss those at whatever point is appropriate per the chairman.
Representative Hull.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments from the member from the Gopher Committee, is it possible to ask for the Attorney General to weigh in on use of ARPA funds? Because at some point, if this state has to defend that, this is not about the Gopher Committee making a recommendation. It truly would be the AG having to defend that action in court. And knowing of several lawsuits across the country right now on this, I would want their opinion on this more so than a committee.
I will see if we can get that opinion. I don't think there's anybody here from the Attorney General. No one seems to volunteer that, so we'll have to make a separate request. Further from the committee members. Representative Hewitt.
I just want to add that probably at some point we're going to come to a conclusion. And if we come to a conclusion, it's going to be one bill. We can't vote to adopt all of these amendments and previous bills that haven't amounted to a hill of beans. We need to have a comprehensive bill, and it has to be something that can be enacted. One of the things that I've noticed is that in terms of the funding, there's been talk around the LOB here about the fact that I think in the state, either the Missouri or Mississippi has been sued concerning this, but they're talking about the ultimate ability of the state to actually spend the money. One of the things I noticed in at least one of these amendments is a statement of the money being expended, but if it turns out that it can't be, something else is going to happen. That's one of the ways you get around all of these lawsuits that are filed all over the country, which many of them probably don't have a chance in hell of getting a positive result. So I think that we can proceed with analyzing the information we have in front of us and coming to a conclusion as to what ought to be presented to the legislature as a whole, rather than to just debate among the amendment such and such and amendment so and so. Let's just get all our eggs in one basket here and decide what to do, and then we can take the necessary steps to put the exact document that the legislature wants out so that it can be voted on.
Are you suggesting that we try to have OLS put it into one document?
I was thinking about that, actually, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ripple?
Mr. Chair, isn't that why we were going to
Wait till
do
I get
some?
Mr. Ripple's reply. What do you think of asking the OLS to combine the parts of this that are the same into one amendment, separating it by section 1, section 2, and so on, and then we can vote separately on the sections?
I think you could definitely do that. I'm not sure. I think that would work. I'm not sure if they should all be listed as non-germane amendments for the upcoming hearing next week. I'm really not sure how that would be noticed, but it could definitely be done. They could be broken out into individual amendments.
Yeah, I think if there seems to be a need to see one document, because rather than go back and forth, well, that's the same in this one, same in that one. If there's sections that are similar that can be combined, so we don't have to keep looking back and forth, and we can just, obviously, one will say, here's we're going ahead with funding. The second one will say something to the effect that, these are the things that need to be incorporated in the building, and the other one will say, here's the things that need to change in the reasons to incarcerate people. So we put them in like section 1, section 2, section 3. I would propose that we vote on them separately, and whatever survives with the majority vote will go forward. The ones that do not survive, those sections may be eliminated.
So So just to be clear, so you're requesting only one amendment, but you want the individual components broken out separately within that amendment?
Yes, and things that are common in the different amendments could be in the separate sections.
Okay.
Where they're common. Further, Representative Irv.
So I would just point out that 746 is that single amendment that contains everything that's in the thing that came out of Division 1 and 3. And these other two pieces are components of that as well. And then there are changes. And if you do what you just suggested, I don't think you'll pass anything out of committee, because 746 is intended to be a whole that will capture the appropriate sense of the House as to what the House believes should become the continuation of the Sununu bill. And yes, it does go beyond what came out of Division 1 and 3, specifically with regard to the change of law, but that's only a component of what is in there. We passed a thing called HB 254 out of the House last year twice. And that is what maybe we haven't all heard, but most of us have heard that that was what died in committee last year with the Senate. So for those that haven't heard, now you have that as well. And it's important that it be considered as a whole, the changes to the law in conjunction with the Sununu Center, because the changes to the law relate directly to the kind of minors that should be incarcerated, well, either detained or committed at the Sununu Center. So I would suggest if you want to have two versions, you have 746 as one, and that could even be like the second version. And then you go back to what came out of division 1s and 3s, and then have Representative Edwards add in the changes that he put into the two pieces that he has here. So then that's a unified version, and you'll have two unified versions to consider at that point in time.
Can both get together with Mr. Ripple and the OLS and try to work this out and bring us something that will be isolated, because I see there are parts like Section 5 in your bill might be Section 1 in one of the other bills. So I just want to separate them out where it's very obvious. Are we approving the construction? Are we approving this, the way it's used? Are we approving who can go there? So I see them as three separate things. Question.
Mr. Chair, I just would want to remind folks that HB 254 was last term. That was a different house. That house has been dissolved. It doesn't exist. The criminal code changes that are being brought to finance at the 11th hour have not been heard anywhere in this House. It's being brought into the Finance Committee at the last moment, and that's why this is non-germane. I think, given that we have a budget that we need to do in the next few weeks, that we ought to stick to our knitting, which is let's do the finance things. And either of my amendments will do the finance things, and we can turn the rest of this over to criminal and family law. They've retained House Bill 120, and they can include their consideration on the criminal code changes in due course, rather than us trying to jam a non-germane amendment through into a finance committee.
That will be the discussion for a week from Wednesday. Representative Hall for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So looking at the various versions in front of us, in particular the section labeled appropriation, which is section 5 in, in 746, and it's section 1 in 738, and I don't know where it is in the other one. The language in the appropriation section changes into Representative Hewitt's comment earlier, right, about they may use these funds, and if they can't use type language, they shall be pulled from general funds. I'm not the attorney here, but whichever one is the best version of those various appropriation sections relative to the management of the ARPA funds, and I leave that to people who know the law better than I do, let's put that in there, because it looks like the latest version references statute part of SB 1 that passed into law, and the older version was in reference to where we were when we were working on this a couple weeks ago. I don't know what the right one is, but whatever the appropriate appropriation language, let's get that into this version.
You're all invited to attend with Mr. Ripple that want to have some input to OLS. They have very small cubicles, but I'm sure they can make an arrangement. Maybe we can meet them somewhere else, but to get something cogent that is separate sections, because I believe there are agreement on some sections, but not all of them. Further.
This reminds me of a committee of conference, and I bite my tongue when I say that, but is there a way to have a versus B versus C comparison Excel file that kind of highlights the differences between them so we can track it?
Mr. Ripple?
If there are multiple amendments, we can do a side-by-side comparing the amendments, yes.
Thank you. Further on this question. All right, for the work in the afternoon, Division 1, are you having a meeting? 1 o'clock for Division 1, and you will be discussing work session on the budget in Division 1. District 2, 1 o'clock, work session on the budget. Division 3.
We're going to do some of that, but we also have 4 specific bills that have been put into the calendar.
And you will, have they been advertised that you will meet with them this afternoon?
Yes, and they're posted.
Very good.
And I would just point out that that's at 2 o'clock, not 1. For
That's
Division 3.
2 o'clock for Division 3. Okay, so if you all want to go and have a meeting now or ask Mr. Ripple, I will try to call the Attorney General and see what I can get on ARPA funds and so on. And enjoy your lunch, and thank you for being here. Look forward to some clarity on this issue, if it's possible. Thank you. End of